Good morning. My name is Milt Okun. I'm a record producer, music publisher, arranger, mostly retired at the moment. I'm living in Beverly Hills, California. I started my career as a music teacher in New York City, as a junior high school music teacher. And at one summer I was hired as a pianist to travel with Harry Belafonte for his group. And on returning to New York, after a couple of weeks of teaching, I got a full-time offer from him if I would leave the school system and come to work for him, which I did very happily. I started out as his pianist in the band, then I became assistant conductor, arranger, and then finally his conductor. I traveled with him and worked with him for about 5 years, until I was fired. It was very lucky for me that he fired me because I went on to become very successful and earn lots of money in my own name. Whereas if I weren't fired, I would have done the same for him, bringing in artists for recording and for writers for publishing. So the best thing that ever happened to me was his firing me. I was arranging and producing records, and I specialized in the folk music scene when it happened. And my major artists were Chad Mitchell Trio, the Brothers Four, Peter, Paul, and Mary. And out of the Chad Mitchell Trio, eventually John Denver, when the folk scene collapsed. I recorded individuals from the groups. The only one who was successful was John. So I worked with him for the rest of his career. And the last artist I worked for as a record producer was the opera singer Placido Domingo. Since I was a child, I loved opera. And popular music, where I made my living, was work, but my heart was in classical music and opera. And I met him one night. Was at a Grammy dinner. The Grammys were then televised from Los Angeles, and we were in New York, and RCA invited me to the dinner. And I was up for arranging and producing a record called The Belafonte Singers Sing Something or Other. And at the table was Mr. Domingo, who was quite young at the time. And he was up for an album that I knew of, Duets with Leontine Price, one of the most beautiful albums ever made. All these years later, I still listen to it several times a year. My record never sold 10 copies, was never on the radio, was a total stiff, and yet we won the Grammy for Best Folk Recording of the Year. And his masterpiece didn't win. That got me to thinking, and eventually I heard him sing, and he was truly the best singer I had ever heard. And at the time I was doing very, very well as a producer. Denver had, at one point, 3 albums in the top 5 in the country, and I thought I was pretty big. And I thought I could make a classical hit out of Domingo. So I tried to reach him, and I tailed him for 5 years. And I'd go to London when my kids were in school, and then I'd go there when he was at Covent Garden. I'd go to San Francisco when he was there, go to the Met, and try to meet with him, tell him my ideas for a record. And he kept putting me off. I think he thought I was some kind of overage groupie. And but finally, at my wife's suggestion, I wrote him a letter, gave him my credits, and told him my ideas for an album. And he called me, and we started recording. And he still is, I think, probably the greatest singer of his century. I made a record called Perhaps Love. It's just 21 years ago now. And on it, I put a duet with John Denver. John Denver and Domingo singing Perhaps Love. And it became an immediate hit. And the Domingo album went on, it's now sold over 7 million. There was never a single released of the song which helped Domingo's album. It was on Columbia Masterworks. John was an RCA, and while I got permission for John to sing with Domingo on an album, couldn't get permission for a single, which led to my divorce from RCA, because at that point John really needed a hit. He hadn't had one for 5 years. And the minute this duet went out, it was being played all over the country, like a major pop hit. And it charted on Billboard first week at 17. Just radio play, no sales. And then Billboard discovered that it wasn't a single, and they said, you have to have the single put out, or else we have to unchart you. Couldn't get RCA to agree to allow it. And it was very sad because John, who really could have benefited from it, didn't. Domingo did. And he went on to, make millions. And he turned from an opera singer who was idolized in the opera world and totally unknown outside it to a public figure, which enabled him to do all kinds of things and have major record sales all over the world. And ironically, I had just been fired from John's producing by RCA. Our records were going like that. And you do blame the producer, and it would have bothered me, but I had just finally succeeded in getting Domingo to do an album, so I felt no pain at all. And the album I turned in with John that was not accepted had one great song on it, the song perhaps Love, a love song. And RCA decided to have John work with another producer, and they hired Larry Butler, who was a very well-known Nashville guy. John was very unhappy, even though I sort of took the fall for the failure. He was really co-producer. As time went on, he got more and more involved in the production. So he took it as a criticism of him, which it was. But they couldn't get rid of him. So he was recording with Larry Butler in Nashville the same week that I was doing Domingo's album in New York. And about 2 weeks before the recordings, John calls me and he said, Larry doesn't want to do any of my songs on the record, which puzzled me because John had only had hits with his own songs. Every album of his had half his songs and half of others, but he never had a hit except for his own songs. So I said, John, you need a hit, and RCA thinks Larry can give it to you, so go along with it. And if you're not happy with the result, you can just say, no, don't put it out. It's totally with your approval. And I said, and he's obviously going to record Perhaps Love. That smelled like a hit. He said, no, he doesn't even want to do that. I called him back a couple of hours later. I said, you're sure Larry doesn't want to do Perhaps Love? He said, yeah. Well, let me show it to Placido. He said, oh, that would be great. I'd love him to do it. Went over to Placido's apartment and played him the record that we had originally turned in the year before. And he had listened to a lot of John's records in picking, he did Annie's song, Follow Me. So he said, I never heard this song on any of his records. I said, no, it's not been released. He said, well, why is John letting someone else release it instead of himself? I said, it's a long story. Do you want to do it? He said, absolutely. And that night I went back to my apartment and said, ooh, wouldn't that be a nice duet? Trading lines. And we did it that way and became a hit. And turned Domingo into a worldwide mainstream artist rather than just an opera artist. I see two kinds of music producers, those who are basically technically oriented and those musically oriented. And I think either one can be successful. There have been major hit makers who concentrate on the technique and the technology, and others who are concentrating on the music. I was a musician, so I had to depend on my engineers and mixers and mastering engineers. So I believe that a better producer is a music man rather than technical, but couldn't prove it. The main thing is helping the artist pick the repertoire, pick the songs, and pick the musicians. And John Denver was really a very special artist. He brought in musicians that I would never have brought in, who were not studio people, but people he met on the road, folk artists. And I think each of them brought a color to the record that would not have been there if I had produced it alone. So John was really a very, very musically oriented person. So a musical producer, and you can tell the guitarists when they're flat, which you can. I had a classical background, so I could help John. He came in one night with a song, a new song he'd written, played it for me on the piano, and it was very beautiful. I said, John, the only problem is that it's the exact melody of Tchaikovsky's Fifth Symphony, second movement. And it was already a hit some years back. I forget the name of it. And I played him the Tchaikovsky melody, which was his first 8 measures. He went over to the piano in the corner, and came back, and I changed it, so now only the first phrase was the same. And it got to be his biggest song, Annie's song. Da 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 da, which is the second movement of the Fifth Symphony. So a technology-oriented producer would have let his original song go through, and he would have been sort of ridiculed, I think. As a matter of fact, I think the secret of my success has been only finding great artists. I know a lot of producers, a lot of friends think that they're the ones who make the great music. And I think spending more time finding someone who's really good pays. So what makes them great? It's so ephemeral, it's hard to say. And you get them in all fields. I think Pete Seeger is great. I think John Denver was great. I once asked Placido, sort of in a way, what makes him great? Music is really your passion. He said, no. My passion is for my children, for my wife, for soccer. Music is my life. It's not his passion, it's his life. And
that answers it.
There's a beautiful story about John Denver, sad but beautiful. The last concert I heard him do was here in California, Thousand Oaks. And I drove out to hear him. And I said, on the way back to his hotel, I said, John, I really have never heard you sing more beautifully and more tellingly. That audience was absolutely entranced. And he said, I think I owe it partially to Mr. Domingo. I said, how was that? He said, when we first recorded Perhaps Love, and it was such a success, you once pointed out to me, listen to the way Placido colors his words. When he sings, love is like steel, the voice is like steel. When it's like a cloud, it's like a cloud. And you hear him sing, and he makes the words echo the music. Then I listen to his opera recordings, and even though I don't understand them, I know what he's saying by the emotion he imparts. So I go back home and I spend, a couple of hours a week going through my old songs, seeing what I can do with my voice and my guitar to really point out what the emotion is. Let the music make the emotion more real. And, you know, I